In the early 90s, Riverside's women became the target of a sadistic killer.
We have bodies all over the county. We're on this thing 24/7.
His victims subjected to a twisted form of brutality.
He had taken the breast that he had cut off and tossed it maybe 30, 40 feet away.
As his confidence grew,
he wanted to be in power. He wanted to be in authority. He wanted to be in control.
the body count rose.
We had to catch him. He wasn't going to stop.
Once you get the taste of blood like that and you're a serial murderer, you're going to continue doing it.
But what was the root of his inner fury?
He would turn around, look at me, and it was like, oh God, you know, now I'm going to get it.
And was he born to kill? Riverside City in Southern California. A community originally built on the rich pickings of a booming citrus industry. By the 1990s, the farming fortunes had faded away, but a shift to light industry had revitalized the local economy, ensuring the sun-drenched community was still firmly on the map.
Riverside was very much considered a suburb of the Los Angeles area. We were about 50 miles east of Los Angeles in Orange County, and it was a very quiet community. People loved it.
It was very social, very friendly. It reminded me a lot of southern communities.
Although crime figures were generally low, one area did not live up to the city's clean-cut reputation.
This was quite the boulevard in the day where everybody hung out.
Former detective Christine Kears recalls Riverside's notorious crime hotspot.
University Avenue was, I would say, a cluttered street, disheveled, drug dealers, gang members, prostitutes.
After dark, you didn't want to drive down there if you were a normal citizen.
From the freeway up, the girls would hang out and the Johns would pick them up.
They were drug users, they had families to support, so they would go out and work the streets, getting money, turning tricks, getting their heroin, and taking care of their families.
Although Detective Kears was used to the daily challenges thrown up by the streets, a call to a factory complex in December 1991 would reveal a crime of an altogether different nature.
The middle section of this trash bin holder was open. And the body was right here.
27-year-old local prostitute Susan Sternfield had been brutally strangled. But the killer's twisted actions had not ended there. He had elaborately positioned the victim's body after she had died.
She was what we call posed. She wasn't just laid out, she wasn't just dumped there. Her feet, her hands, her legs were positioned by the perpetrator.
The body was posed for us, legs open, basically saying, here's your trash, it's right here. Brings back those horrible memories.
But the bizarre nature of the crime had been witnessed before in Riverside.
There was a worker at another industrial complex who was cleaning, and he went to the dumpster and found a body lying inside.
As in the case of Susan Sternfield, prostitute Cheryl Coker had been brutally strangled. The killer had also spent time displaying the victim's body after her death.
She was basically laid there, her legs were spread apart.
Rarely does the killer position the body or take the clothes off the body. It was a very purposeful, specific killing.
When a killer poses victims, it's a kind of in-your-face statement to whoever finds them. So it adds one more layer to their feeling of power.
Detectives were also shocked to discover that the victim's body had been grotesquely mutilated.
On Cheryl,
There was a severed breast.
We found it up the hill where he would have thrown it. It was probably at least around 50 to 70 feet from the body, so it was a purposeful heave.
They obviously did not like prostitutes or did not like ladies of this nature because of the violence that had taken place with her.
As Detective Kears compared the cases of the two murdered women, she quickly began to fear the worst.
I went back and spoke with my superiors and told them that we've got a pattern going here. So where this is going to take us, we'll find out.
We were beginning to sense that we had a serial killer in our midst.
The Riverside community would remain unaware of the danger lurking amongst them. One such resident was easygoing local Bill Suff. "23 years previously, he had been fresh out of high school in nearby Lake Elsinore. As an awkward teenager, he had never managed to land a long-term girlfriend, but one local girl had caught his eye.
I was about 15, and it was at a football game in California. I saw him, and he seemed like a pretty nice guy. He was good looking, and he had a nice smile. He was kind of shy. I gave him my phone number. I said, give me a call. And I really did not expect to hear from him again.
Although Bill relocated to Texas for basic military training, he exchanged a number of letters with Terrell. However, some weeks later, a phone call from the new recruit would be met by some shocking news.
I did tell him that I wasn't going to be able to see him anymore because I had, been raped and I got pregnant. And he said, no, let's get married. I'll take care of your child. And so December 13th, 1969, we were married.
The newly wedded serviceman was away in Texas when Terrell's daughter was born.
He came back and told me that we couldn't take the baby back with us to Texas because he had told his superiors that the baby died. And that kind of threw me.
Bill would arrange for his mother and stepfather to adopt Terrell's newly born baby. Several years earlier, Suff's own childhood in a single-parent family had fallen somewhat short of the all-American dream.
Bill Suff grew up with a very dominant, cold, non-loving mother. He was always trying to acquire his mother's approval, and she denied it to him at every turn.
His father left when they were young, so conversations about the past, I think he was trying to avoid them.
As the eldest of 5 siblings, Suff would take on a leading role in the household.
Bill's place in the family was really the substitute patriarch. The other kids got into trouble ranging from killing animals to starting fires, and Bill was always the hero who got them out of trouble.
The fact that Suff had to take over a lot of responsibilities when his father left would have affected him in some ways, but I think because of this, he probably found a way of controlling others and controlling his environment.
But despite being a dominant force at home, Suff wouldn't stand out at school.
He was involved in the high school marching band. He didn't have any disciplinary issues or problems. His grades were pretty average, nothing unusual.
But the reserved teenager was evidently not happy with his lot.
He was trying to get attention from his different classmates. He was like a non-entity.
Most of his friends and acquaintances didn't think of him as certainly the big man on campus.
He was desperate for approval and recognition, and he wasn't receiving it from anybody. And it just infuriated him. It created this powerful rage in him to prove his worth, his value, and his power, basically.
As Suff continued his studies, no one could have ever imagined the extent to which he would go to make his mark in Riverside County. In December 1990, police suspected a link between the brutal murders of 2 Riverside prostitutes. Both victims had been strangled and elaborately displayed in a ritualistic manner. As police searched for leads, they were desperate to catch the perpetrator, who was striking directly at the vulnerable women within the community.
The women that would work University Avenue were actually pretty well known. Many of them grew up in the Riverside area, and so they went to school, their families were there as well.
Having worked in the Vice Squad, Detective Kears knew the girls well and was determined to restore safety on the streets.
I think they felt like I understood, so they would share things with me.
I would make sure I would go out and meet the girls, and I would give them advice and tell them, you know, be very careful. I'm not here to arrest you. I'm just letting you know that we have a crazy man out here that's killing prostitutes.
Many were left with little choice but to continue working the streets. 10 months earlier, one such woman in nearby Lake Elsinore had been 35-year-old Carol Lynn Miller.
My mom was this tiny little pretty thing, but she was like a force of nature. She was the sweet, loving mom, and she liked to write poems and draw and go to church. I had photographs that we would take during that time, and I could see it in my face. I could see it in my eyes and my smile, just how happy I was to be with my mother.
However, Carol Lynn's life was becoming increasingly troubled. Although he frequently visited her, Shannon would predominantly be brought up by his grandparents.
She also had this dark side that was kind of shrouded by drugs, so I got to see both sides of her. She was a prostitute, and I had to come to terms with that. But through all those times, she was always my mom, and as I got older, I started to understand more her struggles.
But in February 1990, tragedy struck.
My grandma threw her arms around me and said, I'm sorry. Your mom passed away.
Carol Lynn's body had been discovered in an isolated spot within a citrus grove. Her body had been displayed in a brazen manner after her death, caused by asphyxiation and multiple stab wounds.
She had a number of centered stab wounds to her chest. They weren't random, not slashing, just very deliberate.
I got hit with a sledgehammer. That's what it felt like to me. My body swelled with emotion. I felt like the world was collapsing in around me. And I went out to my little trailer that I lived in behind Grandma's, and I just laid on the bed, collapsing.
Although Carol Lynn's displayed body bore the marks of a brutal attack, an object discovered at the scene revealed a different side to her twisted killer.
And there was a partially eaten grapefruit by the body.
If he felt he could eat a grapefruit while standing there and looking at the body, looking at and admiring his work, and that would tell one that he is definitely not worried about the police catching him.
When an individual goes above and beyond what is necessary to kill the person, it tells you just how gratifying it is for him to expose himself to the risk of apprehension in order to carry out what he's doing.
The Sheriff's Department had also discovered 2 other victims, bizarrely displayed on open ground, their bodies subjected to mutilation and other grotesque forms of abuse.
One victim was found with a light bulb that had been inserted up her vaginal area. We had items stuffed down people's throats and mouths after they were dead.
When Detective Kears linked the method of murder with the cases in Riverside, there could be no doubt the sadistic crimes were the work of one man.
The cause of death in these cases were strangulation. The pressure was so much, it would break the bone here. So it was quite violent.
Strangulation for murder is very personal, puts the person very close to the victim and feeling the life force leaving. So that is often about domination and a feeling of power.
Despite a lack of witnesses, the brazen killer had left tire marks and carpet fibers at many of the murder scenes, giving investigators an insight into his movements.
And so they realized the perpetrator was going back and forth between the county sheriff's department area and the city in the same vehicles, and that they needed to combine resources to finding this person and stopping him.
As detectives created a joint task force, Riverside County Warehouse would be called upon to help with logistics. One of the regular stock clerks was local man 40-year-old Bill Suff.
He would provide us with all the equipment, all the desks, all the chairs that we needed to create the task force site.
As well as carrying out his duties, the diligent employee would also show an interest in the ongoing investigation.
He had conversations with our investigators about the homicide victims. Matter of fact, a homicide victim was found one morning when two of the investigators were with Bill, and their pager went off, and Bill made the comment to them, "Oh, did you find another body?"
20 years earlier, Bill Suff had just relocated to Texas to pursue a life in the Air Force. However, his career as an aide in a military hospital hadn't been illustrious.
His military career was essentially unremarkable, certainly not glorious.
I do not know what kind of discharge he got. One day he's in, the next day he's not.
And it would soon become apparent that the newly married Suffs were not headed for wedded bliss.
Bill's relationship with Terrell was one of manipulation, control.
He didn't like me going to the laundromat alone. He didn't like me going grocery shopping alone. He was the one that was supposed to be in charge of everything. Our sex life was, you're ready when I am. I would lay down and do it and be glad.
And Terrell would soon discover more worrying signs from her domineering partner.
We had a kitten, and one night he was meowing and meowing and meowing, and Bill told him to shut up. And the cat just meow, 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 and so he had a little BB gun, and he shot him with a BB gun and killed it. And that scared the bejesus out of me.
Although the arrival of a baby boy was met with Suff's approval, his enthusiasm didn't last.
He was pleased right after the baby was born, but then Billy took up an awful lot of my time. So I couldn't pay total attention to Bill.
Terrell would become increasingly disturbed as her husband's behavior towards their son deteriorated.
He would smack him on the face. I told him, "You don't do that." And he would kind of turn around and look at me, and it's like, oh God, now I'm going to get it.
He had no attachment or no bonding to anybody, including children. It meant nothing to him to beat a child.
He doesn't see them as people. He sees them merely as objects, and very similar to the way he saw his wife. They belong to him. They're his possessions.
Despite Suff's abusive behavior, the couple would have another child. With Terrell working to make ends meet, Suff would become the stay-at-home dad until tragedy struck in 1973.
He called me and said something's wrong with the baby. So I said, I gotta go.
When Terrell arrived back at her flat in Fort Worth, she headed straight for the couple's bedroom.
Dejanay was laying on the bed, and Bill was saying, there's something wrong, she's not breathing, there's something wrong. And I was like, did you call an ambulance? He says, no.
When the emergency services finally arrived on the scene, it would prove too late for the baby girl.
They pronounced euthanasia dead. And then I found out that my baby had been so abused.
The injuries that the doctors were able to diagnose on Deschanel were extensive, and it indicated chronic physical abuse. Her liver had actually been ruptured by a fist blow to her stomach.
He tried to give the impression that he was upset, but I never saw tears.
A Texas court would sentence Bill Suff to 70 years in prison for the murder of his 2-month-old daughter. "17 years later, in 1991, the posed body of a 6th prostitute, Kathleen Puckett, had been discovered near Lake Elsinore. Police would focus their search on the victim's regular workplace, Riverside City's notorious University Avenue.
I did feel like this is definitely where he was going to select victims from, because this is where most of the victims came from. Well, I don't think the girls really felt like they were in danger, even though they were warned, spoken and constantly about protecting themselves. You know, everybody thinks it can never happen to them. It happened.
But despite the focus of their investigation, a break in the case would eventually come from out of county. A tip-off in Wisconsin established a prime suspect for the twisted murders that had plagued Riverside for over a year.
We thought that the suspect might be a truck driver because they fit a lot of the profile type of information. Going out there, we felt this is our guy.
It was published in the newspaper that we were all back in the Midwest looking at a suspect in this case.
But as investigators headed out of state, Detective Kears would be forced to return to the back alleys of Riverside City as yet another murder was unveiled.
The body was located over here in the dirt outside the back door here.
And there was no mistaking whose work it was. Riverside's serial killer had struck again.
The body was laid out, nude, exposed.
Her legs were spread out and her arms were not just randomly dumped.
To expose their genitalia in private areas would be disgusting for a woman to know that somebody has done that to her.
The body would be identified as another prostitute, 24-year-old Cherie Pacer.
Cherie Pacer was a deaf girl, young, sweet.
This was a very sad situation.
As the remainder of the task force returned from the false lead in Wisconsin, police felt there was little doubt that the killer was sending them a very personal message.
He was mad. He was responding to the fact that this task force had gone off and diverted attention from whatever he was doing.
I think he thought, oh, well, I'll show them. I'm right here still.
In 1991, Riverside Police and the Sheriff's Department had formed a task force to hunt a prolific ritualistic killer preying on local prostitutes throughout the county. But as the body count hit 7, the elusive perpetrator remained one step ahead of the authorities.
It's very difficult with this investigation of not knowing when we were going to have the next body, where the body was going to be. As an investigator, I believe serial murder cases are one of the most difficult cases to solve.
Once we had an announcement in the newspaper that a body had been found, it wasn't much longer we'd have another body. So it told me that this guy is just running wild.
7 years earlier, in 1984, local man Bill Suff had been paroled in Texas, having served just 10 years for the murder of his baby daughter. Newly divorced, the 34-year-old had decided to relocate.
Despite the fact that he was supposed to not leave the jurisdiction, Bill came back to his old stomping grounds, Riverside at Lake Elsinore, and just started his life over as if anything wrong that had occurred had been just a big mistake and he was an innocent man.
He was very mild-mannered, he was friendly, he was outgoing, he was helping people, he was your next-door neighbor.
Bill Suff liked to be known as somebody who was standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. And he was going to be there to protect you, certainly to the extent of being someone who was out watching your back when you weren't watching it.
Bill would hold down a variety of jobs in Riverside City and was always keen to get involved in the community.
He won the chili cook-off at the county employees picnic one year. And the county had a ride-share program, so employees would get together and environmentally do the right thing and commute to and from work together. He was the poster boy with his silver van. He was there smiling on the cover, and the headline said, "Take a ride with Bill."
In 1990, 40-year-old Suff would marry an 18-year-old supermarket girl. His second wife would soon learn there was a very different side to the happy-go-lucky Bill Suff.
He basically was like a boss to her. He just dominated her completely.
She was just pushed around and scared off. He wanted you in a position where you would never dare investigate or ask a question or intrude on him in any way.
Despite his prior conviction for the murder of his child during his first marriage, Bill would father another baby girl.
The problem with adding a child to any Bill Suff relationship is that he's the narcissist, he's the egoist. It's all about him, and it ceases to be when you have a child to take care of.
Increasingly absent from home, Suff would focus his attentions on an issue that he insisted was plaguing the area.
He would go around telling people that there was a problem with the prostitutes and they needed to clean up the area and get rid of the prostitutes.
He would just make raving comments about the prostitutes being a plague upon the city because they're dirty, they carry disease, they discourage other business.
But despite his campaign to have the working girls removed from the streets, Suff was leading a double life that was at odds with his impassioned rhetoric.
In fact, he was partaking of the prostitute services. He was very much two personas in the same body.
And all the time, Bill Suff's secret life would remain hidden.
It's not like he came home with a load of excuses as to why he was gone for hours and hours. He would just simply come home at whatever weird hour it was and go, "Hey, honey, I'm home."
I don't think he wanted to tell anybody about anything of what he was doing or what he was thinking. He had no attachment to adults, to women, to children, to animals, to anything.
Just 6 months later, the ritualistic killer plaguing Riverside County struck again, with the murder of prostitute Kelly Hammond. But this time the elusive perpetrator had slipped up. The victim's best friend had witnessed her being picked up in a silver van.
She told me that he was a white male, probably in his late 40s, who wore glasses. So now we have a color of vehicle, we have a description of an individual. Now we need to find the individual, we need to find the van, and we can tie it all up.
As the task force attempted to close the net around the killer, Bill Suff's nighttime visits to the red light district would remain under the police radar. However, during the day, he would regularly brush shoulders with the law as he handed out police equipment in a county warehouse.
Bill really enjoyed this role because he got to be seen as the boss of the warehouse. They knew he was not the boss, but whenever they wanted anything, they had to go see Bill.
Bill was simultaneously a popular, okay guy, and yet for other people, he was that guy who seemed to make you a little bit uncomfortable, but you didn't know why.
Although Bill wasn't employed by the police force, he would take a keen interest in law enforcement in his spare time.
His apartment complex, he always would like to view himself as the protector, as a security guard type of individual. He'd have a jacket that almost looked semi-official.
If people saw him in an odd place, they wouldn't think, oh, what's he doing there? It was like, oh, that's Bill. He's supposed to be in that odd place.
As Suff continued to patrol his neighborhood, Riverside police were desperately chasing up leads following a detailed description of the suspected serial killer. However, Detective Kears was about to experience another unexpected turn to the horrific case.
I made a comment that this particular individual had a specific desire for white women. The chief at that point made a statement indicating that our suspect didn't like African-American females, he liked white girls. And it was after that that we found the body of McDonald.
Catherine MacDonald had been a black prostitute, last seen working Riverside's University Avenue.
The publication in the paper, I think, drove our suspect to say, I can get African American, I don't need to just get whites, I'll show you.
Part of that is disdain. They think they're superior to the investigators, but also it's a feeling of, I'm the one in charge, I'm the dominant person here, I'll make decisions about what I do or don't do.
Worryingly, the killer's change of MO appeared to be partnered by an increased level of violence.
Her breast was removed, which was one of his traits, but she also had additional stab marks. The wounds on her were so severe and so violent that she was almost decapitated.
And the killer's heinous crimes were becoming more frequent.
Because of the manner in which these homicides were occurring now at an exponential rate, we became more concerned.
Once you get the taste of blood like that in your serial murder, you're going to continue doing it.
In 1991, a Riverside task force finally had the description of a man suspected of murdering at least 11 innocent women. But as police tried to close the net around the elusive killer, the hunt was becoming increasingly desperate.
We had to catch him. We had no choice. He wasn't going to stop, obviously. Matter of fact, he was expediting his rate of kill.
We had bodies all over the county. We were on this thing at 24/7.
As they continued to be targeted, Detective Kears would stay close to the working girls on the street.
I would talk to the girls, build up that rapport with the women that were out there working so that they would trust me, that they would call me if something happened, that they knew that it wasn't just about catching a murderer, it was about helping them.
The detective had built up a particularly close relationship with 39-year-old Eleanor Cazares.
Eleanor Cazares and I got along very well. Eleanor was sweet, soft, just a gentle person. It was such a difference from her family background.
As the festive season approached, Eleanor would continue to work University Avenue, despite the fact that a serial killer was on the loose. Just 2 days before Christmas, he would strike again. As usual, police would discover a meticulously posed body when they attended the murder scene in a suburb of Riverside City.
An upper class area, so rather interesting.
The condition of her body was displayed. Some of her fingernails were broken, and her body had been moved from one spot to another.
The killer's trademark brutality was also plain to see. The victim had been horrifically mutilated, her breast cut off and thrown away from the corpse.
I wanted to move the hair off of her face so I could see who it was. And that's when I moved the hair, and it was Eleanor.
An autopsy would later reveal that Eleanor Casares had been murdered and dumped in broad daylight by the increasingly brazen killer.
When I saw who it was, I was very, very upset.
I just felt sick inside that this happened on my watch. I felt really responsible to get this solved and get it solved immediately.
And Eleanor's death might just provide the key to unlock the sordid case.
There was a lot of evidence here. I was able to determine that the perpetrator had actually backed up into the place where he stopped. I was able to tell the investigators exactly what tires that we were looking for.
Unusually, none of the tires on the killer's vehicle were of the same make.
How many people drive around with 4 different types of tires on their vehicle? That's very unique and unusual to begin with.
Police now had detailed information on the van and an eyewitness description of their prime suspect. The task force was placed on high alert to catch the prolific killer before he struck again.
The plan was that if anybody stopped a vehicle and the individual driving it matched the description, they were to call me.
It would not be long before a traffic officer pulled over a silver van for an unauthorized U-turn in the red light district of University Avenue.
He looked inside the van and saw a green blanket which matched a lot of the fibers. We saw rope in the van as well.
When she got the call, Detective Kears had just one question for the patrolman.
Look down and tell me what the driver's side front tire brand was.
And when I asked them to go to the passenger side and give me the brand of that tire, that's when I said, okay, I'm en route.
Christine arrived at the scene and was finally confronted with the man she had been hunting for over a year. 41-year-old Bill Suff.
I looked at him and I was rather shocked that he was so plain looking. Very calm, spoke very softly. Didn't look like somebody that could commit the atrocious acts.
At that point in time, he was arrested and brought to the station.
My family was contacted by a detective, and they said, we got him. And there was a huge ripple of relief that went through my family. And for every family that was involved in that case.
But despite his arrest, Suff remained unperturbed until Detective Kears steered the questioning to the recent murder of Eleanor Casares.
I leaned forward to him and I said to him, you were in the orange groves.
His attitude then did a complete change, a 180.
He said that when he was out picking oranges, that he ran across this body and there was a knife in her and he pulled the knife out. And then he made a spontaneous statement of, and I didn't cut her breast off. I never even asked him about that.
Despite Suff's claims of innocence, a search of his van and home would unearth damning evidence.
We found what we characterized as trophies or souvenirs, personal items belonging to the victims. Matter of fact, some of the victims had jewelry that he had taken off the victims' bodies and given to his girlfriend.
3 years later, in 1995, Paul Zellerbach would lead the case against Bill Suff.
Well, I had charged him with committing 13 murders of the prostitutes. We believe he probably murdered 20 to 25 victims.
The victims' families would play a significant role in the ongoing trial.
And the mothers and the sisters and the children got to testify during the penalty phase. I took pride in demonstrating to the jury that these weren't just prostitutes.
Despite an overwhelming case against him, Suff would continue to plead his innocence.
Prosecutor Zellerbach and the news media have all painted a grotesque picture of me as a cold-blooded, heartless monster. They couldn't have been more wrong about me. I am a caring, loving, and helpful person. Ask anyone who was close to me.
In August 1995, Bill Suff was found guilty of 12 murders.
The jury returned a death verdict, and ultimately he was sentenced to death 12 times.
Although the brutal killer was safely off the streets, many were left wondering why he had waged his vengeful campaign against Riverside's working women.
He was bitter, very bitter, and a lot of that was towards women. I had a domineering mother. Your wife leaves you in prison, divorces you. Women are always doing something wrong to you.
In his mind, the prostitutes would represent just the lowest of all possible females. At the same time, because he can pay them and tell them what to do, they're also objects to be controlled.
But were Bill Suff's brutal actions the inevitable result of the troubled path he trod? Or was he born to kill?
It's hard for me to say someone is really a born killer, but he certainly had a lot of predisposition.
I think he was born with this tendency to violence and cruelty, and he actually had that within him. But so do a lot of people, and they don't act on it and they never do anything with it.
Something triggered his actions that allowed all the past upbringings and challenges to surface.
Maybe our marriage breaking up might have sparked it. Killing Dejanay might have sparked a little fire, and then it had 10 years to burn from prison in Texas.
For many, the memory of Suff's murderous campaign has finally faded. But some will never forget the vulnerable women who lost their lives.
When I reflect on my mom and remember her memories, I smile. I don't really dwell on a lot of that negativity. My life now, I try to live with honor, be trustworthy, and set a good example. And that honors her memory, because I'm her son.
The night Florida forgot her name, the rain came down warm and heavy, the kind that turns streetlights into blurs and makes every shadow look like it's moving on its own. A car door slammed somewhere near the marina. A woman's phone rang and rang until it didn't. By morning, the town would wake up to a headline that felt unreal, a single word pulsing across radios and coffee shop televisions like a warning, missing. In 2003, Florida was already used to vanishing things, boats swallowed by storms, people drifting in and out, but this was different. This was a person with a routine, a voice people recognized, a life that left fingerprints behind. And yet, by sunrise, she was gone. The street where she was last seen looked ordinary enough to be forgettable. a narrow ribbon of asphalt bordered by palms and low houses bleached by salt air. Neighbors would later say they heard nothing unusual, just the hum of cicadas and the distant slap of waves against docks. Police arrived with notebooks and flashlights, scanning gutters and hedges, cataloging the small debris of a Florida night: a discarded cup, tire marks softened by rain, a single shoe half hidden near a storm drain. It was the kind of detail that feels meaningless until it doesn't. They marked it, bagged it, photographed it, and still, the picture refused to come together. The victim, because that word arrived quickly, had a life that looked stable from the outside. A job that paid the bills. Family dinners that happened on schedule. Friends who could tell you her favorite coffee order without thinking. She wasn't known for taking risks, not the kind that end with police tape and unanswered questions. That's what made the disappearance hit like a punch to the chest. This wasn't a runaway story. This wasn't someone starting over. This felt abrupt, violent, wrong. As the hours stretched into days, the town tightened around the search. Flyers bloomed on telephone poles. Volunteers combed wetlands under a sun that offered no mercy. Helicopters traced slow circles over mangroves and canals, their rotors chopping the air into nervous pieces. Tips poured in, each one promising clarity, each one dissolving under scrutiny. Someone thought they saw her at a gas station miles away. Someone else swore a van had been idling too long near the marina. The phone at the police station rang until the lines went dead, and still the space where she should have been stayed empty. Detectives followed the usual paths first. The last phone call. The last person to see her alive. Credit cards that went silent at exactly the wrong moment. They reconstructed timelines with surgical precision, measuring minutes like they could weigh them. A gap appeared, small at first, then impossible to ignore, a window of time where anything could have happened and no one could say what did. In that gap, theories multiplied. A chance encounter. A targeted attack. An accident covered by panic. Each theory brought its own shadows, its own suspects, its own dead ends. The evidence refused to cooperate. There was no clear sign of struggle, no blood trail leading somewhere definitive, no camera footage sharp enough to swear by. Florida in 2003 was not the Florida of wall-to-wall surveillance. Cameras blinked and missed things. Phones didn't track steps the way they do now. Memory did the heavy lifting, and memory is a fragile witness. Statements shifted. Details blurred. What one person remembered clearly, another denied ever seeing. The case file thickened, heavy with paper and uncertainty. Weeks passed. Then months. The initial urgency cooled into something harder, more dangerous, routine. The case moved from the top of the board to the middle, then lower. Detectives rotated. Leads dried up. The community tried to return to normal, but normal had changed shape. People locked doors earlier. Parents waited longer in driveways. The marina lights stayed on all night, bright as a challenge to whatever had taken her. Every cold case begins with a moment like this, when hope and exhaustion collide. Investigators don't stop believing all at once, belief erodes. It wears down under unanswered calls and empty searches. The family learned this slowly, painfully. They learned the sound of a phone that doesn't ring. They learned the language of police updates that say everything and nothing. They learned how time stretches grief until it becomes part of the furniture, something you trip over every day. Years slipped by, measured not in breakthroughs but in anniversaries. New detectives reopened boxes, held old photographs up to the light, asked the same questions with new voices. Technology advanced, promises followed. DNA testing that didn't exist before now whispered the possibility of truth hidden in plain sight. Evidence was re-examined. The shoe from the storm drain. Fibers no one could place. A partial print smudged into anonymity. Each reanalysis raised expectations, and each result landed softly, inconclusive, like rain on sand. The town changed, too. Businesses closed. New ones opened with brighter signs. People moved in who had never heard her name, and people moved out carrying the story with them like a bruise. The case became shorthand, a phrase locals used without explanation. The Florida 2003 cold case. Everyone knew which one. Everyone knew what it meant. A question mark where a person should be. Then, quietly at first, the whispers started. A tip resurfaced. A name from the early days, dismissed too quickly, now looked different under a modern lens. Someone talked. Or someone remembered differently. The file shifted back to the top of the board. Detectives made late-night calls again, the kind that set hearts racing. The family felt it before they were told, a tightening in the chest that felt like hope and fear sharing the same breath. But even as momentum returned, uncertainty clung to every step. Evidence had aged. Memories had faded. What had been overlooked was now impossible to recover. And still, the narrative pushed forward, driven by a need as old as crime itself, closure. The idea that truth, once found, would settle everything. That a solved case would erase the years of not knowing. It's a powerful idea. It's also a dangerous one. Because not all truths arrive clean. Some come fractured, wrapped in legal language and careful statements. Some answers satisfy the system while leaving families staring at the same empty chair. As the investigation moved again, the town held its breath, remembering how it felt to hope and how much it hurt when hope failed. The phrase, "cold case solved," hovered in the air, premature and tempting, like a headline waiting to be written. In Florida, where the past never really stays buried, the story of 2003 pressed forward under the weight of time. Every step toward resolution cast a longer shadow behind it. Questions multiplied alongside answers. Motives were suggested, then softened. Timelines tightened, then stretched under scrutiny. The more the case moved, the more it revealed how much had been lost in the years it stood still. By the time the word solved was spoken out loud, some people felt relief. Others felt something colder. Because solving a case doesn't always mean understanding it, and hearing the truth doesn't guarantee it will sound the way you imagined during all those sleepless nights. In this town, the night of the rain never really ended. It lingered in the way people spoke her name, in the way they watched strangers a little longer than necessary, in the knowledge that some mysteries don't disappear when you call them closed. And as Florida kept breathing, kept changing, kept forgetting and remembering at the same time, the story of 2003 remained what it had always been at its core. A life interrupted, a community shaken, and a question that refused to rest quietly, even as the world tried to move on. The first arrest did not come with sirens or flashing lights, cutting through the night the way people imagine justice arriving. It came quietly, folded into the early hours of a weekday morning, when most of the town was still asleep and the heat had not yet risen. A name surfaced, one that had been scribbled in the margins of reports years earlier, circled once and then forgotten. A man who had lived close enough to notice routines, close enough to blend into the background, close enough to be overlooked. When detectives knocked on his door, they carried the weight of 2 decades on their shoulders, and the knowledge that whatever happened next would not erase what had already been lost. Inside the interview room, time seemed to compress. The air was stale with recycled breaths and old coffee. Questions were asked carefully, the way you approach something fragile that might shatter if handled too roughly. The man answered without drama, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on a point just beyond the detectives' heads. He spoke of ordinary things at first, work schedules, familiar streets, nothing remarkable. Then came the pauses. Long enough to notice. Long enough to matter. The kind of silence that fills a room and forces everyone to listen. Evidence was laid out piece by piece, not as an accusation, but as an invitation to explain. Fibers that should not have been where they were. Phone records that told a different story when read backward. A witness who had remembered something small, something that only became important when placed next to everything else. The narrative tightened, not all at once, but gradually, like a net being drawn closed. The man shifted in his chair. The room leaned in. What followed would later be described as a confession, but the word feels too neat for what actually happened. It was fragmented, hesitant, riddled with conditions and qualifiers. He admitted to being there. He admitted to seeing her. He admitted to things that could not be unsaid. And then, at critical moments, he stopped short, as if the truth had edges too sharp to touch. Investigators listened, recorded, clarified, aware that every word mattered and every omission would be scrutinized. When the news broke, it did not arrive as a single headline, but as a ripple. A notification on a phone. A murmur on local radio. The phrase, "cold case solved," appeared on screens across the county, bold and declarative, carrying a promise it might not be able to keep. The family heard it in a small room at the station, seated across from people who had practiced this speech many times. Hands were held. Tissues were offered. The truth, they were told, had finally been uncovered. But truth is rarely a clean line from question to answer. It is more often a collection of fragments, some sharp, some dull, some missing entirely. As the details emerged, they brought clarity to certain moments and deepened the shadows around others. There was an explanation for the gap in the timeline, but it relied on assumptions. There was a motive suggested, but it felt thin, stretched to cover something larger and darker. There was an account of the night that filled in some spaces and left others stubbornly blank. The community reacted the way communities do when a long-held mystery is suddenly labeled complete. Some felt relief, a loosening of tension they hadn't realized they were carrying. Others felt anger that it had taken so long, that opportunities had been missed, that the answers had waited while years slipped away. And some felt unease, a sense that the story they were being asked to accept did not align perfectly with the one they had lived alongside for so long. In court filings and press briefings, the case took on a new shape. Dates and times were pinned down with authority. Statements were quoted and requoted. The shoe from the storm drain returned to relevance, now positioned as a key detail rather than a curiosity. The narrative solidified into something that could be presented, defended, and argued. But beneath that surface, questions continued to move, restless and unresolved. Where exactly did it happen? Why was there no definitive scene? How did certain pieces of evidence travel from one place to another without leaving clearer traces? These were not the questions that made headlines, but they were the ones that lingered in conversations after the news cameras packed up. The kind of questions that do not accuse outright, but refuse to settle quietly. For the family, the shift was seismic. For years, they had lived in a suspended state, balanced between hope and resignation. Now they were being asked to recalibrate, to replace uncertainty with a version of events that promised finality. Some of it brought comfort. Names and actions replaced the faceless unknown. Some of it reopened wounds. Details imagined over long nights now arrived with official stamps, heavy and undeniable. The accused man's past was dissected in public. Old acquaintances were interviewed. Habits were scrutinized. He was described in ways that tried to make the story make sense: quiet, troubled, capable. It was tempting to compress a human life into a set of traits that could explain everything. Tempting and misleading. Because explanations that feel satisfying often simplify what is, at its core, chaotic. As the case moved forward, the word solved began to feel less like an endpoint and more like a declaration of intent. The system had done what it could with what remained. Files were closed. Boxes were returned to shelves. The machinery of justice turned its attention elsewhere. And yet, in Florida, the humidity still clung to memories, and the past refused to evaporate. There were moments when the narrative threatened to unravel. A witness statement contradicted an earlier version. A piece of evidence was challenged on technical grounds. The confession, partial and hedged, became a focal point for debate. Was it enough? Did it tell the whole story? Or was it simply the best available version, after too much time had passed? In quiet corners of the town, people spoke in lowered voices about what they remembered and what they didn't. About the man they thought they knew. About the night that changed everything. About the feeling that something was still missing, something that had slipped through the cracks while everyone was waiting for answers. The family returned to the places that had once been scenes of hope and despair. The marina at dusk. The street where the rain had fallen warm and relentless. They stood there not looking for clues, but for some sense of alignment between what they were told and what they felt. Closure, they were learning, is not a switch that flips when a case is labeled solved. It is a process, uneven and deeply personal. In the end, the truth they heard was not a single revelation, but a series of acknowledgments. That the system moves slowly. That time changes evidence as much as it changes people. That some questions will remain unanswered, not because no one cares, but because the past does not always leave enough behind to be fully understood. Florida continued on, as places do, absorbing the story into its layers. New headlines replaced old ones. New mysteries emerged. But the echo of 2003 remained, quieter now, but persistent. A reminder that even when a cold case is declared solved, the reverberations can last far longer than the investigation itself, settling into the spaces where certainty was expected to live and leaving behind a truth that is real, incomplete, and heavy with everything that cannot be undone. Time did not stop moving after the declaration, even if it felt like it should have. Court dates were set, postponed, reset again, each one another reminder that resolution is a process, not a moment. The accused sat behind a polished table while lawyers spoke around him, shaping language into weapons and shields. Words like probable cause and reasonable doubt floated through the room, clinical and precise, stripped of the emotional weight they carried for everyone listening. Outside, the Florida sun burned bright and indifferent, casting sharp shadows that felt almost accusatory. As transcripts circulated, the confession was replayed in fragments, its tone analyzed the way people analyze recordings of storms after they've passed. Experts weighed in, parsing pauses and phrasing, debating whether hesitation signaled deception or simply fear. Some heard sincerity in his voice, a tired acceptance that felt like guilt. Others heard calculation, a man saying just enough to fit the evidence without exposing himself completely. The same words carried different meanings depending on who was listening. The investigation's renewed focus brought old witnesses back into the light, people who had tried for years to forget their proximity to the case. They were asked to remember details that had faded under layers of ordinary life. What time was it, exactly? Where were you standing? Did you notice anything unusual? Memory resisted, offering impressions instead of facts. A sound that might have been a door. A shape that could have been a person. Each recollection arrived with a caveat, an apology for not being clearer. Evidence that had once seemed solid began to feel fragile under this scrutiny. Chain of custody logs were revisited. Storage conditions questioned. The passage of years had left its mark not just on people, but on objects. Fibers degraded. Labels yellowed. The shoe, so central now to the official narrative, became a symbol of both persistence and uncertainty. It had survived the storm drain, the years in storage, the shifts in interpretation, but it could not speak for itself. In the background, the community watched and waited, caught between fatigue and fascination. True crime podcasts picked up the story, their hosts narrating events with dramatic emphasis, sometimes smoothing over inconsistencies in favor of a cleaner arc. For listeners far away, the case became entertainment, a puzzle to be solved over headphones. For those who lived there, it was something else entirely, a reopened wound that refused to scab over. The family felt the weight of this attention acutely. Their private grief was now public property again, dissected and debated by strangers. They listened as commentators discussed motives and methods with casual authority, as if certainty were just a matter of confidence. In interviews, they chose their words carefully, balancing gratitude for progress with the knowledge that progress had come too late to change the most important outcome. As the legal process unfolded, an uncomfortable possibility took shape, that the story being told was sufficient for the court, but insufficient for the soul. The system does not require completeness, only proof beyond a certain threshold. It does not demand that every question be answered, only that enough are. This distinction, abstract in theory, became painfully concrete as gaps in the narrative persisted. Why had certain searches been delayed in the early days? Why had a tip been dismissed when it was fresh, only to be resurrected decades later? These questions did not undo the present case, but they cast long shadows backward, illuminating moments where different choices might have led to different outcomes. Regret, like humidity, settled into every corner. The accused's demeanor became a subject of endless speculation. Cameras captured his stillness, his occasional glances toward the gallery, his hands folded just so. Some interpreted this as remorse. Others saw detachment. The truth, if it existed in that space, remained inaccessible, filtered through lenses and biases. A human being reduced to a set of images, frozen at the worst possible moment. Behind closed doors, negotiations took place. Plea discussions surfaced, then stalled. The possibility of avoiding a full trial hovered like a storm cloud, promising efficiency at the cost of deeper examination. For the family, the idea was both tempting and troubling. A plea could mean an admission, a form of acknowledgement. It could also mean fewer answers, fewer chances to hear the story told under oath, challenged and clarified. As weeks turned into months, the initial surge of attention waned. Headlines shrank. Updates moved lower on the page. The phrase, "cold case solved," lost some of its shine, replaced by more cautious language. Allegedly. According to court documents. The certainty of the announcement softened under the realities of due process. In this quieter phase, doubts found room to breathe. People revisited their own memories of 2003, comparing them to the official timeline. Some details fit neatly. Others resisted. A light that should have been on but wasn't. A sound that didn't match the story. These inconsistencies did not necessarily point to innocence or guilt, they pointed to the messy nature of truth when filtered through time. The detectives who had reopened the case felt the strain as well. They stood by their work, aware of its limitations. They knew better than anyone how much had been lost in the intervening years. How many opportunities for clarity had dissolved. Solving a cold case is often less about discovery than about decision, deciding that what you have is enough to move forward, even if it is not perfect. For the town, the case settled into a new phase of existence, no longer an open wound, but not fully healed either. Conversations about safety and trust resurfaced, tinged with the knowledge that danger had once been close, familiar, unnoticed. The marina still gleamed at dusk, beautiful and unchanged, but it carried a different resonance now, layered with memory. The family marked time differently. Court dates replaced anniversaries. Legal milestones took the place of searches and vigils. They learned the rhythms of a system that moves forward even when emotions lag behind. They learned that hearing the truth does not necessarily mean understanding it, and that understanding does not guarantee peace. As the process dragged on, one fact remained immovable: no version of events could restore what had been taken. Justice, whatever form it ultimately assumed, would arrive too late to change the past. It could only shape the future, offering a framework within which to carry the loss. Florida, meanwhile, continued to hum with life. Tourists came and went, unaware of the history beneath their feet. New residents settled in, bringing fresh routines to streets that had once been search grids. The landscape absorbed the story, holding it quietly, ready to surface again whenever someone asked about that year, that night, that case. In the end, the third act of this long narrative was not defined by revelation, but by reckoning. With the limits of memory. With the imperfections of evidence. With the reality that closure is not something bestowed by a verdict or a headline. It is something wrestled with, over time, in the space between what is known and what will forever remain out of reach. By the time the case reached what was supposed to be its decisive stretch, the weight of it had settled into everyone involved like a second climate. The courtroom air felt heavy, even before the doors closed and the proceedings began. Wooden benches creaked under the subtle movements of people who had been sitting with this story for years, some of them from the beginning, others drawn in only after the words, "cold case solved," reignited attention. Outside, palm fronds swayed in the breeze, oblivious, repeating the same motion they had on the night everything changed. Testimony unfolded in careful sequence, each witness adding a layer that was meant to reinforce the whole. Investigators described the reopening of the file, the moment old evidence took on new meaning under modern analysis. They spoke with measured confidence, aware that every statement would be weighed not just for accuracy, but for credibility. They did not exaggerate the strengths of their case, but neither did they dwell on its weaknesses. This was the version of events that could be defended, the narrative that had survived internal debate and legal scrutiny. Forensic experts followed, translating science into language the room could understand. They explained probabilities and margins of error, how a fiber could link two places without conclusively proving a path between them. Charts appeared on screens, lines and numbers arranged to suggest order in a story that had long resisted it. The jury listened, some nodding, some frowning, each person building a private understanding that would never be fully visible to anyone else. When the confession was introduced, the atmosphere shifted. Audio filled the room, tinny and intimate, carrying a voice from another time. Every hesitation seemed amplified. Every word landed with disproportionate force. The defense and prosecution argued over interpretation, framing the same pauses as either signs of truth breaking through, or of a man calculating his exposure. The recording did not resolve the debate, it intensified it, forcing listeners to confront their own assumptions about guilt and honesty. The family sat through it all, absorbing details they had not known, details they wished they could forget. Some of the information offered clarity, a sense of alignment between rumor and reality. Other parts felt jarring, incompatible with the person they had lost and the life she had lived. They watched as her final hours were reconstructed by strangers, reduced to timestamps and locations, and they wondered how something so personal could be handled with such procedural detachment. Cross-examination exposed the case's fractures. Defense attorneys lingered on early missteps, moments when leads had gone cold not because they were false, but because resources had shifted elsewhere. They questioned the reliability of memories stretched across decades. They pointed out inconsistencies, not dramatically, but persistently, letting doubt accumulate through repetition. Each question was a reminder that certainty had never been absolute. The prosecution countered with context. Cold cases, they argued, are defined by what time erodes. Expecting perfection after 20 years was unrealistic. What mattered was the convergence of evidence, the way independent strands now pointed in the same direction. They spoke of persistence, of a system finally catching up to a truth that had waited patiently. It was a compelling argument, built on the idea that justice delayed is still justice if it arrives intact. As days passed, the rhythm of the trial became almost hypnotic. Enter, sit, listen, leave. The routine dulled the sharpest edges of emotion, replacing shock with endurance. Outside the courthouse, reporters delivered updates into cameras, compressing hours of testimony into seconds of soundbite. Inside, the story expanded, dense and unwieldy, resisting compression. The accused took the stand briefly, his words cautious, his narrative aligned but not identical to the confession. He spoke of fear, of panic, of decisions made in a moment that reverberated for a lifetime. He avoided certain specifics, either because he could not remember them or because he chose not to. The line between those possibilities was thin and invisible. When he finished, the room exhaled, unsure whether it had heard an explanation or an evasion. Public reaction fractured along familiar lines. Some saw the proceedings as validation, proof that persistence had paid off. Others saw them as an example of a system trying to impose order on a past too messy to be neatly resolved. Online forums buzzed with analysis, amateur detectives replaying clips and transcripts, confident they could see what professionals had missed. The case became a mirror, reflecting the desires and biases of those who engaged with it. For the family, the trial was less about convincing others and more about surviving the retelling. Each day reopened memories they had learned to carry quietly. Each evening they returned home exhausted, burdened by the knowledge that no outcome would feel fully sufficient. Justice, they were discovering, does not always arrive with comfort attached. As closing arguments approached, the tension sharpened. Both sides distilled months of preparation into narratives meant to resonate, to linger. The prosecution emphasized continuity, the way evidence, though imperfect, formed a coherent picture. The defense emphasized doubt, the spaces where certainty faltered. The jury was asked to choose not between good and evil, but between competing interpretations of a fractured past. When deliberations began, the courtroom emptied, leaving behind a charged stillness. Days passed with no word. The town waited, again, suspended in a familiar limbo. Conversations circled the same questions, as if repetition might conjure answers. The phrase, "cold case solved," hung in the balance, its meaning contingent on the decision of 12 people behind closed doors. In that waiting, something became clear: resolution, whatever its form, would not rewrite history. It would not give the night back its rain-soaked anonymity, or return the town to its former innocence. It would simply add another layer to a story already heavy with time. And as Florida held its breath, the past and present pressed together, inseparable, waiting to see how this chapter would be sealed, or whether it would remain, like so much else in this case, partially open. The verdict did not arrive with thunder. It came folded into a morning that felt deceptively ordinary, sunlight spilling across courthouse steps, cameras already in position, the town holding its breath without quite realizing it was doing so. When the jury filed back in, faces unreadable, the room leaned forward as one. The words were spoken clearly, methodically, stripped of drama. Guilty on some counts. Not guilty on others. A conclusion that sounded definitive, and still managed to feel incomplete. For a moment, no one moved. The family sat frozen, trying to translate legal language into something that could live alongside grief. Guilty meant responsibility, acknowledgement, a public recognition that what had happened was real and wrong. Not guilty meant limits, lines the evidence could not cross, questions that would remain officially unanswered. The balance between those two outcomes settled heavily, refusing to tip fully in either direction. The accused showed little reaction, a subtle tightening of the jaw, a breath taken and released. Years of speculation, condensed into seconds of judgment. He was led away without spectacle, another figure absorbed into the machinery of the system. Outside, reporters spoke urgently into microphones, summarizing decades of pain in sentences designed to fit a broadcast window. The phrase, "cold case solved," reappeared, careful now, qualified, edged with caveats. Sentencing loomed, another chapter in a process that seemed endless to those who had lived with it since 2003. Victim impact statements were prepared, words chosen and discarded, rewritten and practiced. How do you explain the shape of absence? How do you convey the cost of years spent waiting for a phone call that never came? When the day arrived, the courtroom listened as family members spoke directly to the man who had become the focal point of their loss. Their voices wavered and steadied, carrying anger, sorrow, and something quieter, fatigue. The judge listened too, weighing factors that could never fully account for what had been taken. Sentences were pronounced with solemn precision. Numbers were attached to years, as if time could be quantified in a way that made sense. The outcome was neither the maximum nor the minimum, a compromise shaped by statutes and precedents. It was justice as the system understands it, bounded and procedural. When it was over, there was no release, no sudden lightness. The family stepped outside into the heat, cameras tracking every movement, every expression. They answered questions politely, repeating phrases about gratitude and relief, because those were the words people expected to hear. Inside, the truth felt more complicated. Relief existed, yes, but it shared space with a hollow awareness that the end of a trial does not mark the end of grief. In the weeks that followed, life attempted to reassert itself. Courtrooms emptied. Files were archived. Detectives returned to other cases, carrying the quiet knowledge that this one would follow them anyway. For some, the verdict validated years of work. For others, it underscored how much had been lost to time. The story faded from the front page, replaced by fresher tragedies, fresher mysteries. But in the town, traces remained. People talked about where they were when they heard the news, how they felt when the verdict was read. Some believed firmly in the outcome, convinced the right person had been held accountable. Others remained uneasy, troubled by the parts of the story that never solidified. These conversations did not argue so much as circle, returning again and again to the same unresolved points. The family faced a different challenge, learning how to live in a world where the waiting was over. For years, hope had been oriented toward a single goal: answers. Now that some answers had arrived, the question became what to do with them. They visited the places tied to memory, not to search this time, but to acknowledge. The marina at dusk. The street where the rain had blurred everything. They stood there quietly, letting the past coexist with the present. In private moments, doubts surfaced uninvited. Details from testimony replayed in the mind, scenes reconstructed and deconstructed. The confessions' pauses. The gaps in the timeline. The sense that something, somewhere, had slipped beyond reach. These thoughts did not negate the verdict, but they complicated it, adding layers to a truth already heavy. Experts weighed in after the fact, analyzing the case with the benefit of distance. Some praised the persistence that led to accountability after so many years. Others pointed to systemic failures, the early decisions that had allowed the case to go cold in the first place. The story became a case study, cited in discussions about evidence preservation, witness memory, and the double-edged promise of reopening the past. For the family, such analysis felt abstract. What mattered were the quiet mornings that followed, the routines slowly rebuilt. They discovered that closure, the word everyone used so freely, did not arrive as a single moment. It came in fragments, uneven and unpredictable. A night of uninterrupted sleep. A conversation that didn't end in tears. A day when the absence felt less sharp, if only briefly. The man now serving his sentence faded from public view, his role in the narrative fixed by the verdict. Yet even as his name receded from headlines, his presence lingered in memory, inseparable from the loss. Accountability did not erase impact. It simply named it. Florida continued to change, as it always had. New construction rose near old streets. The marina added brighter lights, more cameras, subtle adjustments shaped by lessons learned the hard way. People who had lived there in 2003 pointed out locations to newcomers, explaining their significance with a mix of resignation and reverence. The story was passed on, not as a warning exactly, but as a reminder. On certain anniversaries, the family gathered privately. They did not mark the verdict so much as the life that had been interrupted. Photographs were taken out, laughter remembered, details shared that had nothing to do with crime or courtrooms. In these moments, the case receded, replaced by something more intimate and more real. And still, late at night, questions returned. They always did. What if someone had listened sooner? What if a detail had been recognized for what it was? What if the rain had not washed things away? These questions had no destination, no answer that could satisfy them. They existed simply because the past had left space for them. The phrase, "cold case solved," remained, printed in articles and etched into official records. It was accurate, in a narrow sense. A case had been adjudicated. Responsibility assigned. But beneath that phrase lay a deeper truth, one that resisted tidy conclusions. Some mysteries had been resolved. Others had not. The story, like the town, carried both facts and echoes. As time moved forward, the sharp edges softened, but they did not disappear. The case became part of the town's collective memory, a reference point for discussions about justice, patience, and the cost of delay. It reminded people that answers, when they come, rarely arrive alone. They bring with them the weight of what was lost while waiting. And so the narrative continued, not in headlines or courtrooms, but in the quieter spaces where people live with what has happened. In those spaces, resolution looked less like an ending and more like a fragile equilibrium, a way of holding truth and uncertainty at the same time. The rain-soaked night of 2003 no longer dominated every thought, but it remained, a permanent undercurrent, shaping how the story was remembered and how the future was approached, one careful step at a time. Years after the sentence was handed down, the case refused to settle into the past the way everyone expected it to. It lingered in unexpected places, surfacing in conversations that had nothing to do with courtrooms or crime. A comment overheard at a diner. A pause during a local history segment on late-night radio. The Florida 2003 cold case had entered a new phase, no longer active in the legal sense, but alive in the collective consciousness, shifting shape as memories aged and perspectives changed. Documents became public through routine records requests, their pages scanned and uploaded, read by people who had never set foot in the town. These files told a quieter story than the headlines had. Marginal notes. Early hypotheses abandoned without explanation. Interviews cut short by lack of time or resources. The narrative, once compressed into a courtroom strategy, expanded again, revealing the complexity that had been smoothed over for trial. For some readers, this deepened confidence in the outcome. For others, it reopened doubts that had never fully closed. Former investigators were asked to reflect, their words shaped by distance and hindsight. They spoke of the pressure to move forward, of the balance between certainty and sufficiency. They acknowledged mistakes without dramatizing them, aware that every decision made in real time carries consequences that only become clear later. Solving a cold case, they said, is often about choosing which questions to pursue and which to leave unanswered, a reality that rarely translates well into sound bites. The family watched this renewed attention with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. On one hand, it meant the story had not been forgotten, that the life at its center still mattered. On the other, it meant reliving moments they had worked hard to place behind them. Each new article, each fresh analysis, pulled them back into a narrative they no longer wanted to inhabit full-time. Healing, they were learning, requires space as much as it requires truth. Anniversaries took on a different tone now. No longer defined solely by absence, they became moments of reflection. The family gathered not to search or protest, but to remember. They spoke of who she had been before she became a case number, before her name was paired with the words cold case. These stories felt like acts of quiet resistance against a narrative that had threatened to reduce her to evidence and outcomes. In the town, younger residents grew curious. They asked questions their parents had stopped asking, unburdened by the fatigue of years spent waiting. Teachers mentioned the case in discussions about civic responsibility and the justice system. It became an example, not just of crime, but of time, how it complicates truth, how it reshapes memory, how it challenges institutions designed to deliver clear answers. The physical landscape continued to evolve. Buildings were renovated. Streets repaved. The marina expanded, its docks sturdier, its lighting brighter. These changes were practical, motivated by growth and safety, but they also carried symbolic weight. Each improvement felt like an attempt to outpace the past, to assert that the present could be different. And yet, beneath fresh paint and new signage, the old story remained embedded, invisible but persistent. The convicted man appealed, as most do, arguing procedural errors and evidentiary issues. The appeal did not make front-page news, but it mattered deeply to those involved. Legal briefs revisited familiar ground, challenging interpretations and decisions. For the family, this was a reopening they had not asked for, a reminder that finality in the justice system is always provisional, subject to review and revision. When the appeal was denied, the announcement was brief, almost anticlimactic. No cameras. No press conference. Just a line in a legal bulletin confirming what many had assumed. The system had reaffirmed its conclusion. The case officially was over. And still, the emotional calculus remained unchanged. Relief did not deepen. Doubt did not vanish. Life simply continued, carrying everything forward together. In academic circles, the case was cited alongside others like it, used to illustrate the challenges of delayed justice. Scholars debated the ethics of relying on aged evidence, the psychological impact on families, the risk of narrative bias when reopening old files. These discussions were abstract, theoretical, yet grounded in a story that had unfolded in real streets, under real rain, among real people. For the family, meaning was found in smaller gestures. A scholarship established in her name. A bench placed near the marina, overlooking the water she had loved. These acts did not answer questions, but they created continuity, a way to integrate loss into the fabric of everyday life. Visitors sat on that bench without knowing its full significance, absorbing the view, unknowingly participating in remembrance. Occasionally, someone would come forward with a new detail, a memory sparked by an article or a conversation. Most of these leads went nowhere, filtered politely and set aside. The machinery of investigation no longer engaged with the same intensity. The threshold for reopening had risen, hardened by experience. The case had reached a point where additional certainty seemed unlikely, and the system had moved on. But the human mind does not follow procedural rules. In quiet moments, the family still imagined alternate versions of events. A different decision. A different outcome. These thoughts were not accusations so much as reflections, a way of acknowledging the complexity of what had happened. They learned to let these thoughts pass without chasing them, an act of discipline that came only with time. Florida's climate, relentless and cyclical, mirrored this process. Storms came and went, erasing and reshaping the landscape, leaving behind traces that blended into the ordinary. The night of 2003 became one storm among many in the region's history, notable not for its weather but for what it had carried away. As the years accumulated, the case's presence softened. It no longer dominated conversation or memory, but it did not disappear. It existed as a reference point, a shared understanding of vulnerability and resilience. The town had learned something from it, though no one could say exactly what lesson had been learned or at what cost. The phrase, "family finally hears the truth," took on a quieter meaning with time. Truth was no longer a revelation delivered in a police station or courtroom. It was an ongoing accommodation, a way of living with what was known and accepting what was not. It was found in the ability to speak her name without hesitation, to remember without being overwhelmed. In this later chapter, the story's intensity gave way to endurance. The shock had passed. The mystery had narrowed. What remained was the long work of integration, of carrying a resolved case that still felt unresolved in subtle ways. The Florida 2003 cold case had been solved on paper, but on the ground, in the lives it touched, it continued to unfold, quietly, shaping days and decisions in ways that rarely made headlines, but mattered all the same. The years that followed brought a strange recalibration, a period where the case no longer demanded attention, yet refused to disappear entirely. It lived in the background, surfacing when least expected, a reminder that some stories do not end so much as change volume. For those who had carried it the longest, the challenge became learning how to let it exist without letting it define every waking thought. This was not forgetting. It was something closer to containment. The family noticed the shift first in themselves. The urgency that once propelled every decision had softened into something steadier, less frantic. They still spoke about her, still returned to the same memories, but the conversations no longer revolved around questions of how or why. Instead, they focused on who she had been, the details that had nothing to do with evidence or timelines. Laughter found its way back into these moments, tentative at first, then more freely, as if allowed by some unspoken rule that enough time had passed. In the town, the case began to function as a reference rather than a wound. People mentioned it when discussing changes in policing, the installation of new cameras, the way tips were now handled with more urgency. It became part of institutional memory, cited as justification for reforms that might prevent the next disappearance from slipping into years of silence. The story's power shifted from shock to instruction, from tragedy to lesson. New detectives, younger and less burdened by the original failure, read the file as a completed arc. To them, it was a solved case, a success story of persistence rewarded. They studied it in training sessions, noting how overlooked details had eventually become central. What they could not fully grasp was the emotional residue left behind, the way resolution had arrived too late to restore what mattered most. That understanding belonged only to those who had lived through the waiting. Occasionally, a journalist would revisit the story, framing it as an example of justice finally catching up. These pieces were gentler than the early coverage, more reflective, less hungry for drama. They spoke of closure and healing, of a community that had endured and adapted. The family read these articles with mixed feelings, grateful for the respect, but aware of how incomplete any public telling must be. Healing, they knew, does not follow a clean narrative. The bench by the marina became a quiet landmark. People stopped there without always knowing why, drawn by the view, the sense of pause it offered. Some learned its significance and sat a little longer, reflective. Others remained unaware, their presence an unintended tribute. In this way, memory integrated itself into the everyday, no longer demanding acknowledgement, but welcoming it when offered. The convicted man receded further into abstraction, his identity flattened into a line in official records. For the family, this distance was a relief. They no longer felt tethered to his actions or his image. Accountability had been assigned. Carrying it was no longer their responsibility. And yet, the knowledge of him never vanished entirely. It existed as context, unavoidable, but no longer central. On certain nights, when the air grew heavy and storms gathered offshore, the past felt closer. Weather has a way of collapsing time, of pulling old memories into the present without warning. Rain against windows echoed the night of disappearance, and for a moment, the years between then and now seemed thinner. These moments passed more quickly now, no longer overwhelming, but they still arrived, uninvited and potent. The justice system moved on, its attention consumed by new cases, new urgencies. The Florida 2003 file remained intact, archived and referenced only when necessary. It was complete in the way systems define completeness, its outcome recorded, its loose ends acknowledged but set aside. This institutional finality contrasted sharply with the human experience, where endings are rarely so decisive. In conversations about trust, the case still surfaced. People spoke about how easily familiarity can become blind spot, how danger often wears the face of normalcy. These discussions were not fueled by fear so much as awareness. The town had learned that safety is not static, that vigilance must be renewed, not assumed. This understanding became part of the local culture, subtle but pervasive. For the family, meaning continued to evolve. What had once been a quest for answers transformed into a commitment to presence. They volunteered, supported others navigating loss, offered empathy rooted in experience rather than theory. Their connection to the case gave them credibility in these spaces, a quiet authority born of endurance. They did not present themselves as healed, only as continuing. As the 20th anniversary of 2003 approached, there was no official commemoration planned. The absence of ceremony felt appropriate. This was not a date to be marked with speeches or proclamations. It was simply a marker, a reminder of how much time had passed and how much had changed. The family observed it privately, sharing a meal, telling stories, letting the day be what it was without forcing significance onto it. In the broader narrative of true crime, the case became one among many, its specifics gradually blurring into archetype. A disappearance. A cold case. A late arrest. A partial confession. These patterns repeated across regions and decades, creating a genre that risked flattening individual experiences. Those closest to the story resisted this flattening instinctively, insisting, through memory and conversation, on the singularity of the life at its center. The phrase that once dominated headlines now felt distant. Cold case solved had lost its immediacy, its ability to provoke strong reaction. It existed as a factual statement, stripped of drama. What remained was the quieter truth beneath it, that solving a case does not solve everything. It addresses responsibility, not absence. It answers questions, not longing. As time continued its steady advance, the case's grip loosened further. It no longer shaped daily decisions, or defined community identity. And yet, it remained part of the town's story, a chapter that could not be skipped, only read with greater understanding as distance allowed perspective. In this later stage, the narrative did not crescendo or collapse. It settled. It found a place among other stories of loss and endurance, less vivid but more integrated. The Florida 2003 cold case had become history, not in the sense of being forgotten, but in the sense of being absorbed. Its echoes were still audible to those who listened closely, woven into the fabric of a place that had learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to carry what could not be undone. The case entered a quieter afterlife, one where its presence was felt more than it was spoken. It showed up in pauses during conversations, in the way people corrected themselves before making assumptions, in the subtle caution that lingered beneath everyday routines. The Florida 2003 cold case no longer demanded attention, but it shaped behavior in ways so ordinary they were almost invisible. That was how its influence endured, not through fear, but through memory embedded into habit. As years laid over the verdict, the story lost its sharp edges for those who had encountered it only through headlines. To them, it became a completed arc, something that could be summarized in a paragraph, or reduced to a timeline graphic. But for those who had lived inside it, the narrative remained textured, resistant to simplification. They knew where the summaries failed, where nuance had been traded for clarity, and where silence carried more meaning than any official statement. The family felt this divide acutely. Strangers would sometimes approach them, well-intentioned, saying how glad they were that everything had been resolved. The word everything hovered uncomfortably in the air. The family learned to respond gently, to accept the sentiment without correcting it. They understood that most people needed the story to have an ending, a sense of balance restored. Explaining the reality, that resolution and peace are not synonymous, felt like reopening something that no longer needed exposure. In private, memory behaved differently. It was not linear. It did not respect the chronology imposed by investigations and trials. Moments from before the disappearance surfaced with sudden clarity, a laugh, a habit, an offhand remark that now carried unintended weight. These memories were not painful in the way they once had been. They were tender, reminders of a life defined by more than its final chapter. Holding on to them became an act of reclamation. The town, meanwhile, continued its quiet evolution. New faces filled old spaces, unaware of the histories beneath them. A coffee shop opened where a search command post had once stood. Condos rose near areas that had been scoured for clues. Progress moved forward without ceremony, guided by necessity rather than remembrance. And yet, every so often, someone would ask, and the story would be told again, slightly altered by time, shaped by the teller's distance from it. Law enforcement agencies referenced the case when discussing cold case protocols, emphasizing the importance of preservation and follow-up. The Florida 2003 investigation became a cautionary tale in training manuals, its lessons distilled into bullet points. Do not dismiss small details. Revisit assumptions. Document everything. These principles were sound, but they could not capture the emotional cost that accompanied their absence years earlier. That cost remained implicit, carried by those who had felt it directly. The convicted man's name faded from public consciousness, replaced by newer cases, fresher controversies. In this fading, there was relief. The focus shifted back to the person who had been lost, rather than the one who had been held responsible. Her name appeared in quieter contexts now, in dedications, in family stories, in moments of reflection that did not require an audience. This shift felt right, a rebalancing long overdue. Technology advanced, reshaping the landscape of investigation even further. Tools that had been unimaginable in 2003 became standard, raising uncomfortable hypotheticals about what might have been possible if they had existed sooner. These thoughts surfaced occasionally, usually late at night, but they no longer dominated. They were acknowledged, then set aside, part of the acceptance that had slowly taken root. In the broader culture, interest in cold cases surged and ebbed in cycles, driven by media trends and high-profile breakthroughs. The Florida 2003 case was sometimes mentioned in these discussions, its late resolution cited as proof that time does not necessarily defeat justice. The statement was technically true. It was also incomplete. Justice, the family knew, had arrived carrying both answers and reminders of everything time had taken. When storms rolled in from the coast, the town prepared instinctively, shutters closing, routines shifting. These storms no longer felt symbolic in the way they once had. They were simply weather, part of life in Florida. And yet, for those who remembered, the sound of heavy rain still carried an echo, a distant resonance that never fully disappeared. It was softer now, less commanding, but unmistakable. The family found meaning in continuity. Birthdays were celebrated. Milestones marked. Life expanded around the absence, not in spite of it. They learned that moving forward did not mean leaving anything behind, it meant carrying it differently. The case, once all-consuming, became one thread among many, woven into a larger story of resilience and adaptation. In moments of solitude, questions still surfaced, quieter and less insistent. They were no longer demands for explanation, but reflections on chance and consequence. How fragile routine can be. How easily certainty dissolves. These thoughts did not seek resolution. They existed simply because experience had created space for them. The phrase that had once dominated the narrative receded further into abstraction. Family finally hears the truth became less about a moment of revelation and more about a long process of understanding. Truth was not something delivered whole. It was something assembled over time, through facts, through feeling, through living with what could not be changed. As the years continued to pass, the Florida 2003 cold case settled into a place neither prominent nor forgotten. It remained part of the town's identity, a quiet undercurrent beneath daily life. Those who knew listened for it, recognizing its influence in subtle shifts and shared glances. Those who did not pass through unaware, contributing to a present shaped, in part, by a past they would never fully know. In this phase, the story no longer sought an audience. It did not need validation or attention. It existed because it had existed, because a life had intersected with a moment that changed everything. And in that existence, steady and unremarkable, lay a different kind of resolution, not an ending, but an enduring presence, integrated into the rhythm of a place and the lives that continued within it. With distance came reinterpretation. What once felt fixed began to feel negotiable, not in the legal sense, but in the way memory reorders itself over time. The Florida 2003 cold case was no longer experienced as a single narrative, but as overlapping versions, each shaped by where the listener stood in relation to it. For some, it remained a cautionary tale. For others, it was a story of persistence. For the family, it was both, and neither fully captured what it meant to live through it. As new generations grew up in the town, the case became something they learned about rather than remembered. Teachers referenced it in discussions about community safety and civic responsibility, careful to avoid sensationalism. Students listened with the detached curiosity of those for whom the early 2000s already felt distant. The story lost immediacy in their minds, transformed into context rather than experience. This generational shift marked a turning point, the moment when lived trauma began its transition into history. The family noticed this change in small ways. Fewer unsolicited questions. Less recognition in public. The anonymity felt strange at first, then liberating. It allowed them to exist outside the shadow of the case, to be known for who they were rather than what had happened to them. In this space, grief became quieter, less performative, more internal. It no longer needed witnesses. Occasionally, a documentary producer or podcast host reached out, proposing to revisit the case with fresh eyes. The family weighed these requests carefully. Some were declined outright, the risk of distortion too great. Others were considered, especially when framed with respect and restraint. They understood the value of telling the story accurately, of preserving nuance against the pull of simplified narratives. Participation became a choice, not an obligation. In the wider culture, discussions about cold cases evolved. There was more skepticism now, more awareness of the limits of delayed justice. Commentators spoke about confirmation bias, about the pressure to declare success after years of failure. The Florida 2003 case was sometimes cited in these conversations, not as an example of error, but as a reminder that resolution can be complex, layered, imperfect. This reframing felt closer to the truth. The town's physical markers of the past continued to disappear. The last original building near the marina was torn down, replaced by something sleek and modern. With it went another silent witness, another place that had absorbed the tension of search and speculation. The bench remained, though, weathered now, its dedication plaque softened by years of sun and salt. It endured, unremarkable and steadfast, a quiet refusal to erase everything. The convicted man aged behind bars, his appeals exhausted, his story no longer evolving. For the family, this stasis brought a measure of peace. There would be no new revelations, no late-breaking twists. The narrative had reached its legal endpoint. What remained was the human work of making sense of it over a lifetime, a task no institution could complete on their behalf. In moments of reflection, the family recognized how the case had reshaped their understanding of truth. They no longer expected it to arrive whole or pure. They understood it as something assembled from fragments, influenced by perspective and constrained by time. This understanding extended beyond the case itself, coloring how they approached other stories, other claims of certainty. Experience had made them cautious, but also compassionate. The Florida climate continued its cycles, storms and calm repeating with indifferent regularity. Each season layered over the last, smoothing edges, reshaping the landscape. The night of 2003 became one point among many in a long continuum of nights, distinguished only by the memory it carried. That memory no longer dominated, but it remained anchored and undeniable. Community rituals adapted. The case was no longer invoked at public gatherings, no longer needed as a reference point for shared vulnerability. Instead, it surfaced in quieter ways, in personal conversations and private recollections. This shift signaled a kind of healing, not because the past had been resolved, but because it no longer required constant acknowledgement to be honored. The family found themselves thinking less about what had been lost and more about what had been built since. Relationships deepened. New traditions formed. The absence remained, but it no longer eclipsed everything else. Life expanded around it, accommodating without erasing. This balance, once unimaginable, became a testament to endurance. In the broader narrative of true crime, the case receded further, its specifics blending into a familiar pattern. A disappearance. A long silence. A late resolution. For audiences, these stories often blurred together, consumed and forgotten in quick succession. Those who had lived this one understood the difference between consumption and experience, between knowing and living. They carried that understanding quietly, without needing to articulate it. As time continued to pass, the Florida 2003 cold case settled into a state that defied simple description. It was not active, not forgotten, not entirely resolved. It existed in a liminal space, sustained by memory rather than urgency. This was its final transformation, not into closure, but into context, a story that informed without overwhelming, that lingered without demanding. In this stage, the truth the family had finally heard revealed its fullest meaning. It was not a revelation that ended uncertainty, but a framework that allowed life to move forward with honesty. The truth did not provide comfort so much as clarity, and even that clarity was partial. Yet it was enough to stand on, enough to keep walking, carrying the story not as a burden, but as part of a larger, continuing human narrative that extended beyond any single case, into the unremarkable, resilient flow of time. The story reached a point where silence did more work than words ever could. The Florida 2003 cold case no longer announced itself, no longer demanded to be retold. It existed instead as an undertone, a low frequency woven into daily life, audible only if you knew how to listen. This was the final transformation, when a case stops being an event and becomes an inheritance, passed quietly through memory rather than documentation. For the family, this silence was not emptiness. It was space. Space to think without urgency. Space to remember without bracing for pain. They discovered that grief, when no longer forced into the shape of public tragedy, settles into something more personal, less volatile. It still surfaced, but gently, like a tide that follows a pattern rather than a storm that arrives without warning. They noticed how rarely they now spoke about the investigation itself. The details that once dominated conversations, evidence, timelines, testimony, felt distant, almost academic. What mattered were the human moments that had survived untouched, shared jokes, habits, small rituals that carried her presence forward. These memories had outlasted the headlines. They were the truest record. In the town, the case lived on in subtle institutional habits. Dispatchers double-checked calls. Officers logged details more meticulously. Supervisors insisted on follow-ups that might once have been delayed. None of this was announced as legacy, but it was. The past had quietly altered procedure, embedding itself into practice without ceremony. People who moved to the area sensed something without knowing why. A collective attentiveness. A way neighbors watched out for one another without dramatizing it. This was not paranoia. It was awareness refined by experience. The town had learned that certainty is fragile, that ordinary nights can fracture lives, and that vigilance does not always announce itself loudly. The bench by the marina weathered further, its edges softened, its plaque still legible but less prominent. It had become part of the landscape, no longer a destination, simply a place to sit. In this ordinariness, it achieved something rare. It honored without demanding. It remembered without instructing. People paused there because it felt right, not because they were told to. The convicted man remained absent from thought, his role fixed and unchanging. Time had done what trials could not. It had reduced him to context. He was no longer the axis around which memory turned. Responsibility had been acknowledged. The family no longer needed to orient themselves against it. Occasionally, a question would surface in the quiet hours, softer now, almost philosophical. Not why this happened, but how such things ripple outward. How one interruption can alter countless trajectories. These questions were not painful. They were contemplative, part of a broader understanding shaped by loss, but not confined to it. The phrase that once carried so much weight, "cold case solved," now felt like a technical note in a much larger story. Accurate, yes. Sufficient, no. It described an outcome, not an experience. It accounted for a process, not a lifetime of adaptation. The family understood this distinction instinctively now. They no longer needed language to validate it. As years continued to layer themselves over 2003, the sharp boundary between before and after softened. The disappearance no longer defined time as cleanly as it once had. Life had grown around the absence, integrating it rather than circling it endlessly. This integration was not victory. It was survival refined into something quieter and more sustainable. The town, too, had absorbed the story fully. It no longer leaned on it to explain itself. It carried it the way places carry all that has happened within them, silently, thoroughly, without ceremony. The Florida of now was not the Florida of then, but it was shaped by it in ways that could not be undone or fully traced. In this final stretch, the truth the family had heard revealed its last dimension. Truth was not closure. It was not peace. It was permission. Permission to stop searching. Permission to stop waiting. Permission to let the story become part of the past without demanding it disappear. The case did not end with a revelation or a final sentence. It ended with continuity. With mornings that arrived regardless. With conversations that no longer circled the same questions. With memory that no longer needed to defend itself against forgetting. And so the Florida 2003 cold case remained solved in the records, but lived on differently in the world. Not as a headline. Not as a mystery. But as a quiet presence, folded into the ongoing rhythm of lives that had learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to carry truth without letting it consume them. Time continued its work, indifferent and thorough, sanding down what remained sharp and exposing what could not be worn away. The Florida 2003 cold case existed now almost entirely in reflection, a reference point people returned to not because they needed answers, but because it had taught them how questions behave when they are left unanswered for too long. In this stage, the story no longer moved forward. It widened, touching lives indirectly, shaping perspectives rather than events. The family noticed how the past began to surface less as memory and more as instinct. They reacted differently to news alerts, to missing person notices, to stories that echoed familiar patterns. Their awareness sharpened, not into fear, but into recognition. They understood the early signs of a story that might unravel, the quiet details that rarely make headlines until it is too late. This understanding felt like a burden once. Now it felt like knowledge earned at great cost. There were moments when the case returned unexpectedly, carried by strangers who had only recently learned of it. A letter arrived from someone across the country, thanking the family for speaking publicly years ago, explaining how that story had pushed them to come forward with information in another case. These messages were rare, but when they came, they reframed the past. The loss had not existed in isolation. Its echoes had traveled farther than anyone realized. In the town, institutional memory solidified. Officers who had been children in 2003 now worked shifts of their own, aware of the case not as failure or success, but as context. It was something they had inherited rather than endured. This generational handoff mattered. It meant the story would not be forgotten, but it would not be relived either. It would inform rather than haunt. The marina remained active, vibrant, full of ordinary motion. Boats came and went. Laughter carried across the water in the evenings. Tourists posed for photos, unaware of the layered history beneath their feet. This coexistence once felt wrong, almost disrespectful. Over time, it came to feel necessary. Life did not pause where tragedy had occurred. It continued, carrying memory alongside movement. On quiet nights, when the air settled and the noise receded, the family sometimes returned there, not out of obligation, but familiarity. The place no longer felt like a site of loss. It felt neutral, reclaimed by time and routine. Standing there, they could acknowledge the past without being pulled back into it. This balance, fragile and hard-won, felt like progress. Public interest in true crime continued its cycles, surging and fading with trends. The Florida 2003 case surfaced occasionally in retrospectives, framed now with more restraint, more acknowledgement of complexity. The language softened. Phrases like alleged and unresolved appeared alongside solved, reflecting a broader cultural understanding that certainty is often provisional. The family appreciated this shift. It felt closer to honesty. The convicted man's existence faded further into abstraction. News from the correctional system was sparse, procedural, unremarkable. There would be no further chapters there, no revelations waiting to emerge. The story had reached its limit in that direction. Knowing this brought a strange sense of calm. The future would not be disrupted by unexpected turns tied to his name. Instead, attention turned inward. The family measured time not by anniversaries of loss, but by milestones reached despite it. Children grew older. Careers changed. New challenges emerged, unrelated and immediate. The case no longer dominated identity. It had become one element among many, influential, but not defining. In conversations with others who had experienced similar losses, the family recognized a shared language. Not the language of courtrooms or investigations, but of endurance. They spoke about the long middle, the years after attention fades, but before peace fully arrives. They understood each other without explanation. This connection felt like a quiet network, invisible but resilient. The truth, once so urgently sought, now felt settled in a different way. Not because every question had been answered, but because the need for answers had changed shape. Curiosity had softened into acceptance. The mind no longer raced toward hypotheticals. It rested more easily in what was known, even when that knowledge was incomplete. Florida itself continued to change, shaped by forces far larger than any single story. Development accelerated. Populations shifted. The town of 2003 existed now mostly in photographs and memory. And yet, its influence remained, embedded in attitudes, in procedures, in the subtle caution that had become second nature. The case's final lesson revealed itself slowly, without announcement. It was not about justice arriving late, or technology catching up, or persistence rewarded. It was about time. About how time does not heal so much as transform. How it takes what is unbearable and makes it livable, not by erasing it, but by teaching those affected how to carry it differently. In this phase, the story no longer demanded to be told in full. It could be referenced, alluded to, understood without detail. Its power lay not in shock or mystery, but in depth. It had become a story people felt rather than recounted, an understanding passed quietly rather than argued. As days continued to pass, unremarkable and steady, the Florida 2003 cold case existed exactly where it belonged. Not in the foreground, not buried, but integrated. A chapter that no longer needed revisiting to be honored. A truth that no longer needed defending to be real. And in that integration, something unexpected emerged. Not closure, not resolution, but steadiness. A sense that life, having been interrupted once so violently, had found a way to resume without denying what had happened. The story remained, but it no longer controlled the rhythm. Time did. The final stage did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, disguised as normalcy, carried in days that no longer felt weighted by anticipation or dread. The Florida 2003 cold case had reached the point where it no longer needed attention to exist. It had settled into the background of life, present without pressure, acknowledged without ceremony. This was not forgetting. This was coexistence. The family understood now that the case would never truly end. Not in the way stories are taught to end, with clear lines drawn and meaning neatly assigned. It would continue to surface in unexpected moments, in the way certain sounds triggered memory, in the way headlines caught their eye just a second longer than before. These moments no longer felt intrusive. They felt familiar, like a language the body had learned to speak fluently. What lingered most was not the violence or the mystery, but the waiting. The years spent suspended between hope and resignation had shaped them more deeply than the resolution itself. Waiting had taught patience without comfort, endurance without reward. It had stretched time until it felt elastic, unreliable. Even now, long after the truth had been spoken aloud, the sensation remained, a quiet awareness that certainty is never guaranteed. In the town, the case had become a reference point without a name. People did not mention it directly, but its influence was visible in how they responded to disruption, how quickly they noticed when something felt wrong. There was less assumption, more verification. Fewer shortcuts. The past had trained them, silently, to respect uncertainty. The media moved on, as it always does. New cases replaced old ones. New mysteries demanded attention. The Florida 2003 cold case appeared less frequently, eventually reduced to footnotes, citations, brief mentions in broader discussions about justice delayed. This disappearance from the spotlight felt appropriate. The story had never belonged to the audience. It had belonged to those who lived inside it. For the family, meaning emerged slowly, not as revelation but as pattern. They saw how loss had rearranged priorities, how it had clarified what mattered and stripped away what did not. They became less interested in explanations that promised comfort and more attentive to actions that demonstrated care. Their lives reflected this shift in subtle but enduring ways. They also recognized that the truth they had received was not complete in the way truth is often imagined. It answered questions, but raised others. It explained actions, but not motivations. It closed one door while leaving many rooms unexplored. Accepting this incompleteness became part of the work, a discipline learned through years of disappointment and recalibration. At times, they wondered how the story would sound to someone hearing it for the first time now, stripped of urgency, framed by distance. Would it still feel shocking? Would it still resonate? Perhaps. Or perhaps it would blend into the familiar cadence of crime narratives, one more example among many. This possibility no longer troubled them. The story's value was not dependent on reaction. The place where it began continued to exist without acknowledgement. The water moved as it always had. The air carried the same salt, the same humidity. Nothing marked the precise point where life had fractured, and that absence felt right. Tragedy does not always require monuments. Sometimes it requires space to dissolve back into the ordinary. The family's conversations changed tone over time. They spoke less about what might have been done differently and more about what had been learned. This shift did not absolve anyone. It simply redirected energy toward what could still be shaped. Responsibility gave way to intention. Regret softened into resolve. In moments of honesty, they admitted that the case had altered their understanding of justice itself. Justice was no longer a destination. It was a process, uneven and imperfect, influenced by timing, resources, and human limitation. This realization did not diminish its importance. It grounded it. It made room for humility. The phrase that once dominated their lives, cold case, now felt distant, almost technical. It described a category, not an experience. It captured the absence of answers, but not the weight of living without them. Even solved, the case carried the residue of its long silence. That silence had shaped everything that followed. As years continued to pass, the family found themselves less defined by what they had endured and more by how they had adapted. This distinction mattered. It meant the story no longer held them in place. It moved with them, evolving as they did, integrated rather than imposed. There was no final image to conclude the narrative. No dramatic revelation, no closing statement that resolved every tension. Instead, there was continuity. Life proceeding with awareness, memory existing without dominance, truth acknowledged without expectation that it would explain everything. The Florida 2003 cold case remained, officially solved, unofficially unfinished. Not because justice had failed, but because human experience does not conform to clean endings. The truth had been heard, yes. But its meaning continued to unfold, shaped by time, perspective, and the quiet persistence of those who carried it forward. And in that unfolding, the story found its final form. Not as a headline. Not as a mystery. But as a lived reality, absorbed into the fabric of ordinary days, where its presence was no longer loud, but still unmistakably there, steady and unresolved, reminding anyone who listened closely that some stories do not end, they settle. What remained after everything else had thinned out was not mystery, but weight. A quiet, almost invisible pressure that settled into the corners of memory and stayed there. The Florida 2003 cold case no longer demanded attention, yet it never fully released its hold. It lingered the way certain nights linger in the body, recalled not as images, but as sensations, tightness in the chest, a pause before sleep, a reflexive listening for sounds that never come. The family sensed this most clearly during moments of calm. Happiness arrived now without apology, but it carried awareness with it. Laughter felt earned. Peace felt deliberate. They understood, more than most, how fragile the ordinary could be. This understanding did not darken their lives. It sharpened them. It made presence feel essential rather than optional. There were still questions that surfaced from time to time, but they no longer demanded answers. They existed as markers of what could never be fully reconstructed. Gaps in the timeline. Decisions that made sense only in hindsight. These questions were no longer painful. They were simply part of the terrain, like uneven ground learned through repetition. In the broader world, the phrase, cold case, continued to circulate, often stripped of its human cost. It became shorthand for suspense, for delayed justice, for narrative payoff. The family noticed this distance, but did not resent it. They understood how stories flatten with repetition. What mattered was that somewhere beneath the language, real lives had been altered, and that truth remained intact whether acknowledged or not. Occasionally, someone would ask what it felt like to finally know the truth. The family learned to pause before answering. The honest response was complicated. Knowing did not undo the past. It did not replace the years spent waiting. But it did something quieter and more durable. It removed the need to imagine. It closed the space where fear had once multiplied unchecked. The town continued forward, reshaped by time rather than memory alone. New businesses opened. Old faces disappeared. Children grew up unaware of the history beneath their routines. This forgetting was not failure. It was continuity. Communities, like people, survive by carrying forward what they need and releasing what they cannot hold forever. And yet, the case left its imprint in subtle ways. In caution exercised without explanation. In compassion extended without question. In the shared understanding that certainty is rare and vigilance is an act of care. These lessons did not require retelling. They lived on in behavior, not narrative. The Florida heat still pressed down in the summers. Storms still rolled in without warning. The landscape remained indifferent, beautiful, unchanged. Against this backdrop, the events of 2003 felt both distant and immediate, a reminder that time compresses differently when memory is involved. The family reached a point where the story felt complete enough to stop carrying consciously. It was no longer something they revisited. It was something they contained. This containment did not erase pain. It organized it. It allowed the rest of life to expand without resistance. There was no ceremony to mark this shift. No acknowledgement that something had ended. It simply happened, gradually, as attention moved elsewhere and stayed there. The case faded from daily thought, not because it mattered less, but because it no longer needed reinforcement to remain real. In the end, the Florida 2003 cold case resolved itself not through revelation, but through integration. The truth became part of a larger understanding of loss, resilience, and time. It stopped asking to be witnessed. It no longer required an audience. What remained was not closure, but steadiness. A life resumed with full awareness of interruption. A memory carried without urgency. A story that had found its place, not at the center, not forgotten, but woven into the background of ordinary days. And that was how it endured. Not as a question demanding an answer. Not as a headline frozen in time. But as a quiet, persistent reminder that some truths do not conclude a story, they simply teach those who live on how to continue.